Keep going live right now. Okay, and I think we're here.
We are in the house. Love it.
Adrian, go ahead and get us started.
Well, good evening. It's so good to see you guys tonight. I'm Adrian Garrison, and I'm going to be your host for the very first live Q&A by the Threaded Collective. And I'm going to be hosting you this evening as we work through these questions and just these great things to talk through together. Threaded is an organization for people like you who want to effectively bring the love of Christ into racial conflict and conversation. And we know that racial conversations can be a minefield, and we just thought that we could create this space for you to help talk through some of your questions and concerns that you have. So we hope that you had a chance to submit your questions in advance, but if not, don't worry. We would love to get your questions throughout our conversation tonight. Joining me for our first live Q&A are the hosts of Colored Commentary, Marcus Lloyd and Antoine Malone. Now, guys, you're off script tonight. You're live. You don't have your notes.
We're one of, I don't know. We're always partially off script. We're not always.
I'm amazed
exactly
that she thinks we have a script at all. I don't know if we ever have a script, so that's great. No, we definitely come in with what we're talking about each time, so that we kind of are ready for those things. So this will be fun to kind of be off script. So we're great. We're glad you're here, Adrian, too. Like, it's good. Like, usually Antoine makes me do all the hosting and transitioning the questions and all that stuff. And so it's good to have somebody else doing that and enjoying that for Threaded. So thanks for being here.
I'm incredibly humbled that you would put this faith in me, because I have the first question and it's a tech question.
She's like, where is the chat? Right?
Yes. Is this on Zoom or is it on Google?
It's on Google. So
YouTube.
YouTube, right. I'm sorry. Yeah, YouTube.
Okay.
So you're going to want to go to the YouTube channel, and that's going to be the first thing that we provide for you. In case you're looking at this in some other way, there's the YouTube link. So you could use that, and you can kind of have that chat up. Now you'll probably have to mute the video, but the chat will be on the side. So you gotta have that chat up. Now you'll probably
you saw me. You caught me connecting there.
if you saw, we do the live, for Colored Commentary, and it's always at the beginning. We're trying to get that, and it's always like okay, let me get in here. Oh, let me gotta get the mute real quick before it pops up. Yeah, so we are exactly there.
Okay, well, I don't know. You may not have put your faith in the right girl, but I'll do my best. It's a good question.
No, you're good. I got my own. I got my own chat. Although I don't see anybody in. I see people who are here watching, but I don't see them in the chat. So say what's up if you're here. Just type a little something. Let us know that you're there. Because we want to see
who
that
you
you're
are,
here,
where you from,
and doing your thing, and being a part of this thing.
And it's not too late, I don't think, if you want to submit your question anonymously, to go ahead and use the link that you may have found in our Facebook event. I'll be refreshing that to get any questions that come in there. But this is a safe space. Always being encouraged to contend courageously here. So really, we would love to hear your questions, or just any kind of what you're working through right now.
Yeah. And if somebody needs to be here, look, share this mug, share it out to your socials, you know what I mean? Get in here and question and come in. We may not have everything, but we've been doing this for a minute, so we're excited to have the conversation.
Why does this kept? This is my favorite format though. For me personally, I like the talking to people, but I also just, because I'm an idea share person, and so I love the idea of just people bringing their questions and it being a real conversation where we're just back and forth. We don't know exactly what you're going to bring, and we're not coming with any preformed message other than just our knowledge in the topic. But so I really like this format. I'm hoping that this really picks up, because I like the idea of just on the fly, real time interchanging with people and conversing, and in ways that's going to help maybe you guys too, as questions produce other questions and whatever. And so this is a highly interactive time. We're very dependent on you guys. So I'm hoping that, you guys just don't be shy and just jump on in.
Absolutely. And I'm going to try to keep us on schedule. So I'll kick it off with one of our submitted questions. And
Good
Debbie,
luck.
hello. We see you there in the chat. Guys, say hello.
What's up, Debbie?
What's up? What's up, Debbie?
Let's kick it off with, I think, just a question that's going to feel deeply relevant to most of us listening. How do you get a mostly white church interested, involved, or excited about racial reconciliation?
Yeah, how do you get a mostly white church excited, involved, interested,
Yeah.
engaging in the racial conversation? If this was an easy answer, then we'd be doing it all over the nation, right? I think for me, the starting place I want to come with is why aren't you there? For me, I want to say, hey, do you see? And if we get a chance to sit down with churches, I say, do you see the conversation around race as something that Christians in the Bible should speak into? And if the answer is yes, then why? Or if the answer is no, why is that? And I think the conversation can go a lot of places from there. As to however way they answer. I think I would start there. If I were speaking to a church member, I would say, try to see if you can get with your church leadership, an elder or two. I find sometimes if you can get two elders instead of one, I know it seems like one-on-one is good, but if you can get two to chat with and just ask that question, hey, we see this conversation. We think that as Christians, I'm supposed to be doing something here, and get the what and the why behind whether they're involved or not involved. And to begin to wrestle with that. So that's a first step. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but I think what I want to do is try to identify the roadblock, I think, and hear that from leadership direct. What do you think, Marcus?
Yeah, look, so there's two things that I thought of when the question came up. Is one, this is going to sound snarky. I'm gonna just
y'all. I think Marcus is just in a general snarky mood tonight.
I usually am, and this is why it's hard to do the Q&A. But seriously, because when I say it, some people will go, "Oh, this is snarky." I would say, how do you get a church excited? You actually preach the word of God. I think you just people say in this conversation, like, we just need to preach the gospel. Well, I think if you maneuver and if you get into the word of God and you really start to understand the work that Jesus was doing in the midst of the gospel, we see in Ephesians 2, it talks about this tearing down the wall of hostility and taking the two and make them into one. This two was the Jewish culture, the Jewish people, and the Gentiles. Now, these are ethnic groups that Jesus was through his death, burial, and resurrection was actually creating a bridge and a pathway to. Understanding that was happening on the cross, and then taking it to the Great Commission of go and make disciples of all nations, and the understanding of that nations word meaning in Greek meaning ethnos, which is where we get our term ethnicity. Taking that, seeing the work of the Holy Spirit, the very first sort of sign of the Holy Spirit that was given at Pentecost, and seeing that it was communicating the gospel to different languages. Running that all the way then to Revelation 7:9, where you see that God, in his intentional and perfect wisdom, created a throne room in which all tribes, tongues, and there's that word again, nations, which is ultimately ethnos, are present. Recognizing the cultural work and the ethnic work that God was intentionally doing from really the beginning of time through Christ and into the end where we will exist. Understanding that should give us an excitement to want to try to engage other cultures and other people, because it's part of our mission. It's part of the way we actually get to this all tribes, tongues, and nations. So that's one. The second thing to get excited is kind of create some FOMO, this fear of missing out. Like, if you can show people a life lived that is better than the life they're living currently, then they want to do what they can to get there. So what we need more people who are Christians who are living a diverse, and not just, the friends on Facebook diverse life, but we need Christians who are living amongst brothers and sisters from different cultures, experiencing life amongst those cultures, and experiencing the blessing of the Holy Spirit when those cultures come together, which is, the blessing is that you will be able to see God in so many different ways in which he has presented himself to cultures all over the world. And so if we can, as Christians, who's ever asking that question, if you can actually show a lifestyle in which you're living in diverse experiences and having more fun and more experiences, learning more about God, I think more people will want to do that. And so will the church. So those are, very sort of churchy answers to the question. Here's a non-churchy answer to the question. It may be that the leadership may have to change. They may have to be a leadership that is not committed in some way to a kind of homogenous unit principle in which they're trying to find people who look just like them and build a church that way, but one that is effectively trying to be more diverse, and their approach and their relationships as leadership lives that out. So
Yeah,
there you go. Well, I think the Bible is a great place to start for all of us. So like
yeah,
for
let's
you
hope
to
so.
for us to go there first and say, listen, what does the Bible say? And I think that's an important question to ask of any scenario, of any culture question or life question is, well, what does the Bible have to say about it? What does God have to say about this through his word? And so going back to see well, is this new? Is this some new concept? Does the Bible has God in his scriptures dealt with this before? And if so, what did it look like? And yes. And so being able to have that, if you combine these two things together, where you have this lifestyle that you're leading, these new relationships that you're having, this understanding what the scripture says, and then you go to leadership and you ask them, hey, do y'all see this? When you do those things together, you create a conversation that can be had, that says, hey, I think we're supposed to be going this way, and what do you guys think, and make a decision about it. So anyway, that's a huge question.
It's a huge one,
and we could talk about it a lot.
Yeah, it is. It is a great question, and I do appreciate that prioritization of going straight to the Bible. I know, myself and many other white Christians who have been hungry after, understanding racial reconciliation in the past, 2 years in particular. It's looked a lot like a large stack of books on our nightstand, and the books that I think have been most deeply informative to me have been right there in the New Testament. The Book of Acts. Nothing has been more direct and more anchoring to me in this work than that book. And I don't hear that one being recommended very much. And I also would say, starting there and then going, to your second recommendation of making this look good, making this look appealing. If we don't start in the Bible, then unfortunately, those relationships can become a bit acquiring, if that makes sense. We're concerned about we're acquiring certain relationships and having a certain image of being a certain way if our hearts are not anchored in truth. Yeah. So I appreciate that.
And I think prayer for humility in the whole conversation by everybody involved is important, because a lot of times I guess let me be careful, I think, with what I'm going to say next, but a lot of times with church leaders, there's kind of, you can't tell me how to do ministry thing. It's not spoken, but it's there. So if a lay person comes in and says, hey, I think we should be doing this, sometimes that pastor or that those leaders kind of feel like, well, we're the leaders here and we know best. And so there's always prayer involved there, where you pray for a humble spirit about all of it, for everybody, ourselves individually included, and the conversation that we have about it, and perfectly consider how the Spirit would make itself known in that conversation for everybody. Usually in those conversations, everybody's got to give up a little bit of something to move somewhere, because there's already a difference in approach that is the precursor for the conversation in the first place. So those are things.
I appreciate the grace that you're also offering there. Is this conversation, although it's not new, it is a new sort of kind of conversation, right? And church leaders, particularly white church leaders, who have, in many cases, have been kind of living in a bubble, a cultural bubble. It's just being burst for some of them, and they just don't really know what to do. And everything that they are being asked to do is going against all of their cultural norms of how to do whatever it is that they learned how to do. So just, my also advice is, it's hard sometimes, but one of our core values is grace extending. So, extend them grace in the midst of that.
Yes. And I think that this kind of connecting to Brian's comment in our chat right now, just speaking to the dynamic that many white Christians feel that they're in a no-win situation when it comes to reconciliation convos. And I'm interested to see where you guys would go with that. I think it's just striking to me that that would be from a worldly perspective. From a worldly perspective, it can seem like this is a lose-lose conversation sometimes, but I know, like, also, that's the very reason Peter rebuked Jesus, because it seemed as though Jesus was heading into a lose-lose situation. And know that there was absolutely, glory in that, and the ultimate conquering in that. And so I guess that would just be my thought when I see that is just a matter of, keeping kingdom perspective in mind.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Christianity from an earthly point of view is a lose-lose. At the end of the day, or at least it's preparing, it's Christ has laid before us a kind of lose-lose for now, where it pertains to this sort of social, where we're dealing with social economies, not money, but fame, acceptance, so forth and so on. So on some level, at any moment, Christ is calling us to lose, take up a cross and lose, to walk toward the losing side of the battle and sacrifice ourselves there. But in so doing, we win. That's what he says. If you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. If you want to, him who wants to save it. And so I think it's important to understand that part of it is there's going to be a loss in that sense. I also think that Brian may be referring to this idea that some white people feel like there's no way for them to satisfy the desires of certain voices in the Black community who are asking for justice. They don't know whether they should speak or not speak, whether they should celebrate culture, or if they're inappropriately adopting it in some unhealthy or exploitive way. You're not quite sure. Like, every time it feels, for many white people I've spoken with, wherever they make a step, it feels like that's the wrong step, and then they make the opposite step of that, and it turns out someone's telling them that that's the wrong step. And so I do think there's a lot of white Christians who really do want to do the right thing, and part of the right thing is helping Black and people of color understand that they are actually wanting to love them well, and not understanding how to perform the right actions to do that. And I think that's part of what his question may be as well.
Yeah.
On that. I mean, Brian, don't let me put words in your mouth. So you can clarify if you need to.
I have found as a white person, I've had to get super comfortable with being the awkward one. Yeah, for sure, in this conversation.
Yeah. And well, I'll let you go ahead, Marcus.
Well, no, I was just going to say, because I had some computer issues this week, and so I'm just looking on my iPad with this, so I don't have the actual chat up in front of me to see the questions that come up. So if Brian has a question, I'd love to if somebody read it to me. That'll help me get a good sense of what that is, so I can speak to it.
Oh, well, she said, so Brian said most white Christians feel we are in a no-win situation with reconciliation conversations.
Yeah. Said most white people?
That's what that's what you're saying. Whether it's most or like, I think, again, see, the thought I was going to come back to even there was, we talked about grace, and sometimes it's a matter of managing expectations. So it could be that some white people are going into a conversation with a traumatic, with a community, an African American people of color community that has suffered trauma in some way and has responded to that trauma for a long period of time, for lifetimes in some cases. And so in that scenario, there's this deep embedded kind of distrust, weariness, skepticism, even when something looks like it could be headed in the right direction, right? And so there is a kind of grace that everybody needs to be extending to each other, including, say, the white persons who may be actually doing the right things and still getting negative response, to understand that what we're all dealing with is the responses of trauma, and just to remain doing the right thing. Here's the bigger question. if you're doing the right thing and you're not getting the right responses, are you going to stop doing the right thing? And if you're going to stop doing the right thing, were you doing the right thing so that you could be seen in a certain way, or was it really that you loved that other person, that other individual? Some people, when they no longer get the win from it, I did the right thing, and so you're supposed to accept me now, and they may not get that acceptance, and they no longer do the right thing, which makes it about them and their acceptance, and not about the actual right thing that they should be doing, the loving of this other person. If we're going to love other people, we're just going to love other people well, and we're just going to do that until as long as it takes until they figure out, how to work through some of these things. So, I would expect that if I were to meet someone who was abused as a child by a certain type of person, that every time they're around that type of person, there's something that's there that might produce an irrational kind of response. And there's a grace that I would extend to that response in that scenario. So I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, I think that transitions us well to our next question. Unless Marcus, do you want to have a word on that?
Well, my only thing to add to that is, I think for us to, from an analogy standpoint, just think about it in our own relationships that we care about. You know what I mean? We don't just do the thing and move on, right? Oh, well, it didn't happen, I'm done. Like, we keep going. I was mentoring a couple in which the male had cheated on the wife, and they were staying together. But, maybe 2 months after it had all come out, we're sitting together, me and the male and the man in the relationship. And he's like, man, she just keeps bringing it up. Like, I don't know why she's not over it yet. I'm like, wait, bro, you don't get to set the timetable. Like, you did the thing. Like, you don't get to set the timetable on when she's over it. Right. And I think if we're talking about things in generalities, which is what we are talking about, you say that the most white people. So it's a general white thing. Black and white, there has been the general consensus is that white has done some things historically for over centuries to Black people. And so it may just take a little while before they, as I speak as the Black person, that they fully trust that your approach is genuine and not something that's purely to, kind of try to help move past this really quickly, or even to to sort of gain a kind of favor, or to create a situation in which we getting along somehow benefits you long term. So that would be the only thing I'd add to that. Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So our next question is, why is the conversation around race so important to you as Christians? And their comment is that it seems to be such a distraction from real gospel work.
Well, look, I think I kind of articulated that in the first answer that I gave, in that I think there's this misconception that the conversation that we're having is somehow not connected to the gospel. Now, the truth be known, the terminology of race is not, in the sense of that's not a word. When it's used in the Bible, it's not used in the same way that we use it, sort of colloquial or in our vernacular here. But this idea of crossing cultural lines, ethnic lines, which much of the race conversation kind of sounds a little bit like. You have people from different cultures that get labeled a kind of race. But this idea of crossing cultural lines and seeing the cultures come together under the banner of Christ is all the way through the meta narrative of the Bible. And if you get away in some ways from thinking gospel only biblically, but think about it theologically, in the sense of how it describes the nature of God, what we see is that when God created man, humanity, he inserted into humanity all the components that would lead to this, and I'll use a word somebody said at a training I did last night, in this bouquet of humanity that would have all of these different colors, cultures, and tongues. In fact, many times, if you look, God has supernaturally intervened in the humanity in ways that are very much leading to the end game of all tribes, tongues, and nations. You can see it at the Tower of Babel. God, he intervened supernaturally to create the tongues, because we weren't moving away from each other in a way that would naturally do that. And then, of course, to get the gospel out, he intervened again supernaturally at Pentecost with his Holy Spirit speaking in tongues so that the gospel would go to all different nations. And then he supernaturally intervened again to prove to the Jewish elite Peter particularly, that the Gentiles were welcomed into the kingdom by God when with the Gentile Pentecost with Cornelius. So God supernaturally intervenes in these areas of culture, coming across and reconciling cultures together. And so for me, it's hard to actually maneuver through the Bible now and not see all the cultural ways in which God is working, and from start to finish, see how it's very important. But there may be more to that question than I'm handling right there. So Antoine, what do you think?
Oh, well, there's definitely probably more behind that. There's a lot of nationalism probably behind that, quietly, or maybe even subconsciously. There's this connection to America and Christianity, I think, that sometimes creates what sounds like a critical element of America brought in and through the church somehow also is perceived as anti-Christian. And I think that some of that sits in that space. And so under the guise of protecting Christianity, we're really protecting our patriotic pride and interests. And the two conversations can be had separately. They shouldn't be intertwined. I'm not necessarily speaking against patriotism. I'm just saying, let's have a patriotism conversation when we're talking about patriotism, and let's have a Christianity conversation when we're talking about Christianity. And let's not try to have one under the guise of the other, which I think it often has happened, and perhaps less guys increasingly these days. So the conversation needs to be clear and separate to understand what it is we are actually talking about. One of the threats to the conversation that people who I talk to, who typically have this is a distraction from the gospel piece, ends up being about patriotism or politics, and not so much about what the Bible is actually talking about. The scriptures talk about how we are a new creature, how we're a new citizen, and the whole purpose of the gospel, the good news of the gospel, is that not only is Jesus the source of the gospel, but he has a deep effect on society as a result. That the love of Christ lived out through his people looks like something, has a picture, has an effect. And when people see that, that should look different than what they have been doing, without Christ. And that's exactly what we should be doing. So when it comes to race, we're like, well, we know what outside the church is doing with race. Inside the church, there should be some different picture that we see that allows others to see something new and different, some love of God, this love of Christ in action, in effect. And so why do we have a conversation around race as Christians? It's because the relationships that are being affected in the race conversation are revealing the wrong effect to the proper cause. If Christ is the cause of changed hearts and love, then how is it that lack of love is what is being produced in our communities, and even being protected in some cases out of our communities under the guise of various levels of pride? So it's important because Jesus said it was important in John 17. It's important because light doesn't shine in one spot. Light shines all over the place. That's why he says, get it out from under the bushel. He says, lift it up so it shines on the whole house, not just the section of the house, not just this little area, but to light the entire house. That means that there's a wide, pervasive effect of the light. And that should have an effect on our society. And if it's not having that, then why in the world would people want to be involved with what we're doing in the first place?
Yeah. And I think I love that you're saying that, because what it speaks to is in some ways the way in which we have taught a minimal version of the gospel, in a sense, right? Or maybe an individualistic version of the gospel. And again, this is the way we've kind of trained ourselves, right? We have a conversion mentality. It is, the gospel is centered around people coming to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. They make a decision to follow Christ. That's the gospel, right? And so what that is it becomes a very, it's about converting people, individuals. And I think if that was the the end of the story, I think we would have stopped there. But there's more story. And again, if you think about it again, very theologically and even actually missiologically, right? And this is idea understanding the mission of God, which is a really kind of a new term for the church anyway. I don't want to get into church history on that, but thinking about the mission of God is there's a great portion of what God is trying to do that involves a model of who he is and of his image existing in his bride on this planet. And so if it was just about, hey, all I need to do is make sure my neighbor crosses the line of faith and then I'm out, I think we lose that. I think that's a portion of the gospel, but it's actually more than that. It's now this person is not just saved from their sins. They're actually now entered into a family relationship with people from all over the world that are coming together to make God's name famous in the world in such a way and love one another in such a way that it will draw people towards Christ so that they can experience not just life in heaven, but also experience a life on earth that is a dress rehearsal for heaven. And so I think, again, our gospel, understanding the gospel is 4 spiritual laws, cross the line of faith, and we're done. And I think we need a more robust, there are people who have a much more robust understanding of the gospel.
Yeah,
and I think we all need to adopt.
And that's because that's what it is. Like you're saying, Jesus comes and deals with, we're part of a new society.
Yeah.
That's heaven. That's the prayer. On earth as it is in heaven. Mm-hmm. What is it like? What do we imagine in heaven? Well, we don't imagine racial problems in heaven. So what would the church look like if it was on earth as it is in heaven? Well, there probably wouldn't be racial issues, value statements and laws and various types of things among his people that create these sort of value hierarchies and the varying effects of it. So yes, it's a part of what it means to live out the love of God in an everyday life. And it's the part of a marketplace ministry mentality that it has no place. As long as you're about making the sale and closing the deal, then then gospel is only about salvation because that's where the deal is made.
Yeah.
But if it's about living a lifestyle, there's no place for a marketplace in that. That has to do with the essence of who we are and where our passions are and why it is that we would be okay with our brothers and sisters in Christ who are suffering. Why would we not feel something about moving in that direction?
Amen. Well, let's take a short break here. And I think that Antoine's going to key up a short commercial about the Threaded Collective, which is, something we're really excited to share with you.
All right, so I'm going to do it on Zoom because that's how we do it. So let me make sure I get all the things figured out real quick. And wait.
I'm excited for everyone to hear the Threaded Collective. Is something we've been really working on for a while. I think it's a great place and a great spot for people to continue to move further down the road in this conversation.
All right. Can you guys see that?
At Threaded, yes. We're committed to helping you engage in the often divisive conversation around race with love and compassion. We know that race conversations are filled with urgency and passion that often lead to confusion and division. If you're like us, you've had many conversations end with hurt and broken relationships. We specifically designed a membership community called the Threaded Collective to help people like you have a place to grow in your skill, understanding, and spiritual discipleship around the subject of race. The Collective is an exclusive community learning space for people like you who are serious about taking steps to love your neighbor. Each month, new educational resources are added to help push you along your growth journey. These resources include webinars, articles, live Q&A events, and much more, all designed to help you take your next step along the journey. To join the Threaded Collective, visit wearethreaded.org/collective and sign up for a monthly subscription for $10 a month. Or Get 2 months free with the annual subscription of $100. Conversations around race do not have to end in confusion and division. There's a better way to honor our differences while tackling real social problems with the love of Christ. Be encouraged. You're not alone. And maybe we'll see you in the community. God bless.
Right. That's it.
It's fun. It's fun.
Awesome.
I love seeing all
Wow.
those the faces of the folks who lead a lot of the webinars and Q&As and those kinds of things in there. That's fun to see those cats for sure. We got lots more coming. There's hours and hours already in the collective, right, Antoine? And there's more to
There
come.
are.
Yes, and we're so glad that you're joining us again. If you're just jumping on a little bit late, welcome to the Threaded Q&A. It's live and it's monthly. And for this month, and I believe next month, it's going to be here on our Threaded YouTube channel and accessible to all. But from that point on, it really is a special privilege of our Threaded collective that gets to join into this Q&A and kind of really parse out these things that are so important and challenging to work through. So if you like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel right now that you're watching on, and we'll continue with our Q&A session. You can go ahead and pop your questions in the chat right here. We've got a fresh question from Donna. Okay, so she's just giving us some feedback that the explanation of using John 17 was helpful for her. And that just in general, this conversation is helping her, kind of just get some verbiage to go back to her church with. And that is absolutely our hope. And that is our hope in the Threaded Collective in general, that you would not feel alone in this work, and that you would have people you can turn to with your questions and with your concerns and with your when you've been sucker punched, when you're really discouraged. I have personally turned to this community to kind of get help and get back up on my feet with that. And so we would just love for you to join us. I'm gonna steer us toward our next question, which is about, okay, I'm gonna go to this one. Some ideal responses from white Christians for a person of color who has publicly or privately shared the story of racial hurt or trauma. This seems to be kind of a theme and kind of a process that many churches are going through, is, inviting some, if they are an ethnically diverse church, or even if they're a majority white church, inviting some people from their own community to share their story. So I definitely resonate with this question, and this person's wanting to know what are some ideal responses from an individual white person in response to that truth telling?
Well, I think it's always going to be just kind of person to person, but to understand that if I'm understanding the question, Adrian, right, there's a situation in which a person of color has been asked to come into a predominantly white church and share their experience. Is that kind of what the question is?
Or it says publicly or privately. So
yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. First, I hate. Here's one of the misconceptions. I think there's a misconception about when Black people share their story that some people have, that at least I've experienced, in which they go, they're just being a victim. They just love sharing about the stuff that's happened to them. And I want to just go on record as saying sharing the experiences of racism that has happened to me has never been fun. It's never been something that I've been excited to do. There is a kind of a reliving of that trauma. There is a fast beating of the heart. There is an anxiety. There are sometimes tears. There is sometimes shame from the ways you responded or didn't respond. And so what I would say is when you see or hear a person of color sharing their experience, know that it's not something that they woke up that morning going, I can't wait to do this. And so in that, recognizing that the ways in which they may be emoting through it, I think, thanking them is a great way to start. And recognizing how beautiful it is that they would open themselves up with, in some ways, strangers and then possibly even enemies, to get the story out, and so in recognizing that, so thanking them, responding with, it's a beautiful thing. I love you. And sometimes when I think about, just when you're in the midst of counseling or even in the midst of conversation, particularly conflict conversation, and somebody says, hey, this is some of the things I'm dealing with. One of the things that I constantly go is there more? Like what else? Right. So that sometimes it's like, oh, I get to say, like, get more of it out. So those are just a couple of the top that I was just thinking, trying to take it maybe from putting yourselves in their shoes and understanding where they are, and being grateful that they shared. Antoine?
Yeah, I think empathy is always important, but empathetic about this, right? So I love that you started with, most people don't want to have to talk about that. And what we can get from that is that they must feel like they need to say this. And I want you to think about what I just said there. Because if somebody feel like they need to do something that they don't want to do, that means that they've been pushed to the place where they've got to do this thing in order to make the point. Otherwise, they don't feel like the point would be made. The nature of the conversation typically is people of color raise their hand and say, hey, we're experiencing some injustices. The voice comes back and says, no, you're not. And you say, no, really, we are. Here they are at a broad level. Here's the broad level proof, statistics and this, that, and the other thing. And they say, yeah, not really. Okay, so now now you get to the place where my storytelling is not really about me just being opening up and saying, oh man, you guys, I'm struggling with this. Now it's a kind of persuasive endeavor. I've got to somehow convince you that my problem is a real problem. After I've already submitted evidence A, B, C, D. So this is probably evidence E, if you will, or certainly not the first evidence. So we're in this ongoing conversation trying to prove that my problem is an actual problem, right? And so now we get to the place where I tell a story, and then the conversation shows up, and the response, like you said, Marcus, is, well, you guys are just being a victim. And wow, think about the mentality now. So I've been proving, and you said no problem. Now you kind of admit that there is a problem, but I only want to focus on the problem and I won't move past it, which is what you're saying victimization is. So you move from not acknowledging the problem to acknowledging the problem. And so this is what I think is going on in the psychology of a person who's trying to have this conversation, is they're like, the frustration of 1 minute you want to ignore my problem, next minute you want me to ignore a real problem that I've proven to you through a story, while completely skipping the actual conversation about the problem, right? And it moves us from one side of the conversation to the next. So I guess what I'm saying in all that is a sensitivity to the nature of the conversation, right? Your response is one of curiosity. You don't have to own that you're the victim, that you're the villain in this in this story. You can honor the fact that if someone's been smacked in the mouth and they got a bloody lip, that their lip is indeed bleeding. And when they say, hey, I would like a Band-Aid, that they're not being a victim mentality because they actually want their lips healed, right? Even though they were victimized by being hit in the face, right? So this whole concept of pursuing healing and mixing the pursuit of healing with victimization mentalities and all this, I think a general sensitivity toward the difficulty of the conversation, if you can hear me tell you, it's more even than recounting my story. There's an ongoing conversation throughout my life where I'm consistently being told that a problem that I'm experiencing is not what I'm experiencing. So now I've got to tell you a story where I actually experienced it, and now you heard it and you want me to ignore it like you've ignored it. And if I don't, you say I have a victim mentality. That kind of thinking doesn't help bridge gaps, doesn't help us create the proper amount of connection that we need to create. So understanding that sensitivity, and then coming back and kind of doing what Mark is saying. Hey, I appreciate that you decided that you shared that. I know that that's tough for you to share. I know this is not a fun conversation for you, and I don't know exactly, even if you don't know, I don't know exactly what to do, but I do agree that that's a problem, and I don't want you to continue to have to deal with it, could be enough, right? To get everybody to the neutral space of congenial conversation about what to do next.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that that's a really great guidepost. But certainly, if you can, if the context allows, say something, because I think that whether you're outwardly saying you're a victim or you just kind of are a consumer as a white person taking in this story and processing it and not responding, even just whatever the context is, if you can, then you unfortunately, I think it can be a gaslighting experience for those people who have shared their story. And we all have, the enemy is so insidious in permeating our thoughts. And so, if Antoine has had an experience where he has been told that he is, being a victim, then when he shares his story, the enemy is going to plant that feeling and that fear in his mind. It's going to be a thought, whether it's happening or not with the person that he's listening to. And so I think I'm thinking so, because I'm just touching. I want to touch for a moment on Brian's second comment here about white Christians are seen as the enemy, regardless or how or what we do. I think that I just want to name that as the enemy planting an insidious thought that maybe at one point, Brian, you have had the experience of being named as the enemy, but that doesn't mean, as Antoine just spoke to you, just said to you, that just because there's a victim doesn't mean that you are the enemy. And so I think that we get these thoughts in our head, and they just discourage us from doing this work of reconciliation. Storytelling is reconciliation. Respectfully receiving a story is also reconciliation.
Yeah, we say there's a statement real quick, Mark. There's a statement that I've been adopting lately, where when you listen to people, you listen for fears, not fight, right? And when you're listening for fears, you're listening for what about this story has created the fear, right? What are you afraid of? What am I hearing that you're feeling and that has produced fear? When you're listening for fight, you're looking to defend, you're looking to attack, you're looking to deflect. You want to make sure that you're not the target. Right. And if you're sitting there listening to a story, and I think this happens for a lot of white people, what they're hearing is, I am in a fight in this conversation. And I would ask that you don't have to feel like you're in a fight, that you're the person, you're the enemy, you're the other person in this boxing ring. This conversation sometimes is not a contentious one. Now, sometimes it is. But a lot of times in the church context, it's certainly in the context of what we were invited into. A lot of times it's just a matter of understanding and evidence, proving that what we're dealing with is actually what we're dealing with, in an attempt for other people to understand the fears associated with it, and then to be a part of making the change and addressing those fears.
Yeah. So two things I want to comment just a little bit on Brian's, and I'm going to go back to the question in a second. Just this recognition is, from a gospel standpoint, white people are not the enemy, because they are also a part of the bouquet. They are a part of the tapestry of God. So they are not the enemy. So that's where bringing it into a Christian context makes it easier to help us understand that. What we are at, in some ways, the conversation has always really been about, but it gets mishandled in some ways. It's not necessarily about white people as much as the concept of whiteness, this white normalcy that has been throughout the history of our country has been elevated as righteousness, as the way to do things, and everything else being the superior way of doing things, and everything else being inferior. It's the normal way, and everything else is abnormal. Therefore, it potentially is inferior, or in some cases, it's not right, or even not moral. And so, for everybody's listening, the conversation is not about white people as much as about whiteness. Going back to even the thing that you're talking about, again, I was thinking again from that analogy standpoint of a relationship. When you talk about, when you hear, if you have a spouse, maybe you've been like me and you've messed up with your spouse, and I've done it many times. And my wife has to come
today. You've done it like 12 times today.
It's really true. This
just
is
today.
Yeah. Just today. And how those conversations throughout the day tend to work is, hey, here's how I'm upset with you, or here's how I've been hurt, whether that's with me, or sometimes here's how I've been hurt somewhere else. And I think would be helpful even about the response question is to say, here's what you don't do. One is you don't make the conversation about you.
Right.
Right.
100%.
So if my wife is coming to me and she's saying, Marcus, I'm really upset when you do XYZ, and I go, well, the reason I do XYZ is because you do XY, you do ABC, right? What you've done is I've just made the conversation, I've turned it away from me, and I've actually made it now her fault, or I've made it about her, or I've made it a conversation in which it's about me making sure I get over on her and not have to deal with what she came to me with. If I'm hearing a conversation, if I'm hearing her just share about anything that doesn't have anything to do with me, even going, gosh, that reminds me of when I had something similar happen. There's value in that, right? Because that's being able to kind of see through and kind of match your experience. But you have to be very careful to go, I'm not saying that what I experienced is exactly like what you're experiencing. I'm saying this because it's the way I'm trying to find my way closer to your experience. And so I still think your experience is much worse or whatever, but I'm just trying to find my way to meet you as close as I can so that I can live in that moment with you. And so again, it's trying to not make it about you would be super helpful. And there's lots of ways you can do that. And maybe those are a couple of things that may help us think about what that response could look like.
Excellent. Well, should I drop one more question in here? You think we have time?
Yeah, we probably can get one more in.
Okay. Can you talk about how gender impacts the dialogue about race in the church?
How gender impacts the dialogue about race in the church. I'll say this piece. I think there's so much in that question. So I'm going to we'll try to hit it from a couple of different areas. When people talk about gender, are they talking about just male, female gender? Are they talking about the sort of conversation around identifying as male and female conversation? If that's the truth, so this is what I'm going to assume about the question, is that they're asking about that kind of thing, the gender conversation, not just the male and female, but also like the identification and sort of the ways in which people are kind of dealing with the pronouns and things of that nature. I think, and there may be other ways. I think right now that's kind of where the conversation is having really a lot of difficulty, because so much of the conversation gets lumped together in one sort of rights movement. We've seen this really since the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, that as that model of how to really petition a country to start to see people as fully human and worthy of being engaged. That model that was laid out by the civil rights leaders has been picked up by a lot of different other movements and ideas and utilized in the same way. And so the way I think it affects the conversation now is that when people hear the race conversation, they automatically bring all the other conversations together. And so they go, you're not just talking to me about race. Now you're talking about gender. And now you're talking about LGBTQT. You're talking about, there's other things as well, but those are the kinds of things that get lumped together. And so what happens is, if I accept any of your race conversation, then that means I am somehow accepting all these other conversations as well. And so that would be one way that I think that the gender conversation is kind of playing a part in the race conversation. That's just one move at it. Maybe Antoine, you may have another direction.
Well, to ride on your coattails with that, the civil rights movement in America certainly is the poster child for how to deal with, or at least one of the most biggest
successful
models for how to overcome social constructs that created injustices for different fragments of society, whether they were gender-based, race-based, ableist-based, or whatever. And so there is a race conversation where there are laws and there are ways that society dealt with race, and there is a gender conversation where there were laws and there were ways people dealt with gender. And so each one can have their conversation. But I think in America, the civil rights template is the one most often used and piggybacked on by most social injustice conversations, whether they're racially based or not. And in some way that draws a connection. And you're right, Marcus. I've talked to a lot of people who see the race conversation as a slippery slope conversation into a bunch of other things that they like, well, if I accept that, then that must mean that I have to give way in this area and this area and this area. Gender identity, as you were saying, being one of them. But if I were to give a quick little comment about the other potentiality about the conversation, the question being about gender being male and female, right? And how has the race conversation affected that? I would say primarily the race conversation has affected it in that it has called it into question on some level. I think certainly the feminist movement and the movement to get rights for women and the various sort of things that's happening to create equality and in some cases equity, for females and males, don't need the race conversation at all. They can do that without the race conversation. They're disconnected. Where they find connection is the common source of, unfortunately, white male as you look throughout American history. They find a common agitator. And in that sense, there's a commonality that happens in these conversations where it's easier to make a connection because the same person that's hurting you is hurting me for a completely different reason. And there's some connectivity and some kinship in conversation that can happen between the groups because of that common source of agitation. But I don't know that I would say that, there's more to go into even inside the civil rights movement as to what role females played in it, where there were issues there. And so there's a lot to do with gender and in the conversation that we're having from a social point of view over time. And then of course, Christian and biblically, there's the patriarchy and there's the scriptures and the way we understand what the Bible tells us about the roles of men and women. That's a constant source of conversation. That is also bleeding into this conversation, egalitarianism or complementarianism, and moving that into a just or unjust conversation and how that can mix. And so there's a lot of things mixed in this bowl that I said it earlier and I'm going to say it again. I think we have to be careful to make sure that we are having the conversation we're having and not having all these other conversations under the guise of one thing. If we're going to have a race conversation, let's have a race conversation. We're going to have a political conversation, let's have the political. We're going to have a gender conversation, let's have the gender conversation. And let's be careful not to overlap those, because I think we lose some ground when we do that.
I agree.
I just want to offer just sort of a historical narrative that we have to kind of keep our eye on a bit. History is just a really great tool for us to try to understand maybe possibly the actions, the actions of today, the situations of today, and even some of the attitudes of today. And so I'll just kind of throw from it. Just this is it's maybe not left field, but I think it's something that we all need to be aware of in some ways. If you really study history, and you can kind of do a lot of your own stuff, your own work. But there is, we live in a culture that is much like many of the other cultures around the world, in that it was centered around a particular cultural sort of cultural group. And then it also had this patriarchal nature to it, right? So you can go to most countries, you can go to India, right? And you're going to find that the Indian male is going to be the power driver in that society. Why? Because culture, Indian, and patriarchy puts it at male. So the male Indian is going to be the driver in determining a lot of things going on in that particular culture. When you come to America, it is Anglo male, right? And if you look historically in the way that the Anglo male has maneuvered from a gender standpoint, with Black and white particularly, you will see that much of the work to separate Blacks from whites came with the desire to protect the white women from Black men, while these white men secretly abused Black women, right? And then in the midst of that, there is all this sort of psychology that people kind of throw into the conversation, potential of why then Black men seek out white women to get back at the white men for what they did to their Black women, all while Black women are mad at Black men for going after white women, right? So I'm just kind of giving you some of the ways in which historically you've seen some of this gender in the conflict, in the construct of race as well. And again, there's lots of different things we can walk through, but gender and race, particularly in Black and white, has been a very igniting type of thing in the race conversation. In fact, if you go to the lynching memorials down in Montgomery, you read some of the writings on the wall and you find out about lynching. A lot of it has been because a Black male did something or was accused of doing something to a white female. I was just in Greenwood up in Tulsa this last week, and that whole thing that started where 300 Black people were killed and a whole fight broke out in the Black neighborhood where the city was literally flying planes over and dropping nitroglycerin to burn down buildings and shooting people from planes, all started because potentially a Black man touched a white woman in an elevator. But the story has never been verified, right? So those are some of that's just a historical gender sort of intermix of maybe where it's coming to the conversation too.
Yeah. Last thing, and I know we're wrapping up here, but last thing on that, and I know Adrian, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this a little bit too before we close out. But I'm back on sort of the sort of common agitator, and I think, the storyline, the narrative is different, right? Because for African Americans, say it's slavery, and for different racial groups, there's a storyline, there's a narrative, there's some situation that they can refer to, but women were subjected to a particular type of role in society and put into that box by men who were in charge, and they were done, and that was purely because they were women. It was, it's you're a woman and therefore this, and that's not very different than saying your skin is brown and therefore this, or you're from this country and therefore this, or you have sex this way and therefore this, right? And so some of that, there's just a common sense of feeling, right, of trying to break out of whatever box they've been put in that just connects these sort of groups together, and in that sense, there is some commonality there. So
yeah, those were incredibly thoughtful answers and really bring in a very wide context that is essential for us to take into consideration. I think that for me, when I hear this question, I take it pretty literally, and I am just thinking of my own, all I have to offer is really my own lived experiences. And so when I think of how, aspects of gender are impacting this conversation around race in the church, I just think that from my experience inside and outside of the church, when I've gathered for offerings of being educated around implicit bias or social justice or any of these things, I've looked around the room and predominantly seen white women at the table. And that's a conversation that I've had with others. And it's just like, what's going on there? And what's, where do we think that that's coming from? And I would say that, not to speak widely for this group, but mostly it's a sense of empathy is easier to access when we have also, experienced sometimes like just our gender being something that, disenfranchises us or disqualifies us for something. And it allows that empathy to be, that you spoke of earlier, to be a little bit more accessible, as I think generally the assumption there. And I would just say also, that if this is true, if it's predominantly white women in churches with, desiring to be a part of this conversation and move the needle, and that then sometimes we can experience for the first time when we encounter our white brothers on this issue, being told to kind of stay in our lane, that, we encounter some of these gender expectations and gender dynamics for the first time. We didn't encounter it when we were trying to organize a meal train. We didn't encounter it when we were applying for our position at Children's Church. Come on. We are encountering it now, and it concerns me that it could be a way of undermining getting this conversation rolling, getting interest, and getting excitement if the voices that are in the body who are ready to go on this aren't given the same ear.
Yeah, Love it. Statistically, it's true. Like what you're saying, you're speaking, I think, experientially, but I think statistically, women are a huge part of the conversation of social justice, whether it's race or not race. Like when you look at it, it's more women than men who are a part of these conversations and supporting and advocating and speaking out, just by the pure numbers. And it would be interesting to understand or to think through, like, what is that truly? Is there something not obvious to that? Because you're right. You show up in the room and it's a lot of ladies who are willing to step up and do the thing. So thank you for the comments.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thank you
Really
guys for your questions and for your comments. We're so grateful you guys made this evening for us tonight, and we're so glad that you joined us. We want to invite you to go ahead and head to wearethreaded.org/collective to join the collective community, because it's this all the time. You get access, can post your questions and get access to amazing resources there. And go ahead and check out Colored Commentary wherever you get your podcast, and follow Colored Commentary on YouTube. So next month we'll be hosting another Q&A conversation just like this. So be on the lookout for information about that. We're so glad that you joined us.
All right.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Marcus.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, coming out.
Brian, let's see real quick. Brian and Debbie, I think it was in the who chatted, and it looks like Micah jumped in right here at the end. Michael, we'll have to get you offline.
Yes,
we're about to wrap up, but thank you so much for being here. It was fun. I'll see you guys next month.
Yep.
Bye now.